outside the role of, say, the, what did I say?
Seed merchants, seed farming tools.
Not specifically seed.
Garden retailer.
Gardening supply merchant, and I think this is important. So here it is. What these guys are doing is arbitrage. This is not easy to see, but you have to see it to understand the whole concept. So what these guys have is two markets. One is the merchandise of their expertise, and the other is the they will have a bill portfolio. And well, say the build market and the consumer goods market. Perhaps this is better to say. Well, okay, so change that to build market, and I change that to consumer goods market. Okay. What they do is they do arbitrage. So when the fuel merchant goes into his high season, then he has to build up. And this would be in the northern hemisphere, this would be, say, September. Late August, September, October, would have to build up his inventory of firewood and coal. So he has a portfolio of bills, maturing real bills. And he would start selling bills and buying the merchandise which he's going to sell in the winter. So this means he sold this and bought this. So the arbitrage is moving from the bill market to the merchandise market. And the heating season is over. He's going from the high season into the low season. He doesn't have to sell his business, but there's very little demand for fuel in the summer, let's assume. And then what he does is he just has reduced his inventory of fuel, and at the same time the cash he got was beefing up his portfolio. So he was doing arbitrage from the consumer good market to the bill market, you see. So this is the way you have to see. He has a pile of bills maturing, and he has the physical inventory of consumer goods, and according to this change of seasons, he would reduce this and increase that, or vice versa. Now the beauty of it is that there is another guy around the corner who is also cyclical. His business is cyclical in nature, so we'll have to expand and reduce his inventory, but it's just with the opposite signature. So if this was the fuel merchant, the retail merchant for gardening does exactly the same thing, except with a phase shift. Okay? Exactly the same. But when this guy is buying the bills, the other guy will be selling them, and vice versa. So it's a symbiotic relationship. It's just beautiful. It's, as if nature created it. And in fact, nature did, because it's not a human invention. That's the way it turned out to be the case, at least in the temperate zones of the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Now, in the tropics it's different, but basically you can analyze it and see. Well, now we have to go, right? So I just wanted to play this out in front of you, but we ran out of time. But you have enough imagination, and you can see that this is just very beautiful example of how the real bills operate. It's important to remember this arbitrage business. That's what they are doing. They are portfolio and inventory. The arbitrage is back and forth. Okay. Yes.
Permission to ask one question. It's about the circulation of real bills. What you described to us was an analogy of the system as it operated before World War I, because that's the last time it was in practice.
And ever since World War I, no real bills, no significant. I mean, they were trying to imitate it and do it in an artificial way, but it never.
These real bills were redeemable for gold, and legal tender isn't.
No.
And we're now in a complicated set
Excellent
of transactions with electronic banking. So how do you introduce the equivalent into the modern era in a system that is trustworthy and will work?
Yeah. I think this is a very important question. And what happens is that the system works if what the real bill matures into is a superior instrument. Superior instrument. It would be nonsensical to talk about a real bill maturing into an inferior instrument. Now, I try to make the point throughout the symposium that there is nothing between gold coin and real bills. It's nothing. It's just one is next to the other. The second best is the gold is the real bills. So, if it's not going to mature into gold coins, then what is it going to mature into? Federal Reserve knows. No, sir. It's not going to work because the Federal Reserve note is an inferior instrument. It's not a present good. It's not paying interest. It's not paying. It cannot be discounted. In other words, a real bill is superior to the banknote because it is subject to discount. So if you sit on a portfolio of bills, then you have an earning. It's an instrument which has a return, a positive return. So to suggest that any kind of banknote will be suitable.
No, I'm not suggesting that, but I want
No, I'm not saying. I'm just explaining the concept. We have to be out of here in a minute. So I'm not provoking an argument. I'm just stating it as a fact that there is no other instrument than the gold coin into which a real bill can mature. Because a banknote give it the best. The dollar is a poor example, but you can think of Swiss francs or the very best. Nobody doubts that it's a good money to have. But it's, whatever it is, it's not superior to the real bill because the real bill is earning a return in gold coins. And if it's not gold coins, it's not going to circulate. As simple as that.
But the point I'm trying to make is, we don't clear checks, paper checks anymore. And we didn't clear paper real bills, and we're not going to, I can't see us doing that anymore. So how can you clear real paper bills in an electronic era? when there needs to be speed of transaction and
Well, we can't get into that. I mean, we have limited amount of time. I mean, you're asking questions which give rise to another symposium, but there is answer to you.
Well, the thing is that it's not, we won't have a gold standard unless we have a practical system that works.
That's next year. No, but it's a good question because it's
Oh yeah,
it needs to be thought through how we would be able to operate under that completely different system with our technology and our use of e-trade and what have you. So it's a good question, but I think it wouldn't be the next phase. I think that's what the professor is trying to say. We have to go through so many phases that we haven't time to talk about it next year.
One last, I just want to say this. This is the underlying principle. It must mature into gold. Now you figure out how to do it electronically. There's modern technology, there's modern thinking. Stick to the right principle, stick to that root, and build the branches from there.
Yeah,
Done.
it can be
Better,
done.
faster, more secure. That's the short answer.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Before we thank the professor, a suggestion was made that we have a group photo taken tomorrow at some stage. So I'm just letting you know that that will happen. I'm not sure yet with whose camera, but your camera?
I got a camera if you
Oh,
need it.
very good. Yes, we'll accept your offer. So in case you want to dress differently. I'm not.
Anyone have a suit I can borrow?
Some people should.
Put your gold tie on. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Louis. Okay. So today, I'm going to briefly discuss some common misconceptions about gold, fraudulent activity behind the underlying monetary mechanism, a review of the quantity theory of money and the modern monetary mechanism. And we're going to do this by starting with the comments of a standard linear economist. And a standard linear economist in this case, the standard linear economist in this case is Dr. Martin Wolf, who I'm sure you're all aware of. Mr. Bilderberg, Mr. Big Shot, Mr. FT commentator. So he wrote a few weeks ago, the biggest transition problem is the mismatch between the value of official gold holdings and the size of the monetary system. The value of gold held by central banks is circa 1.3 trillion, while global deposits in the banking system, according to McKinsey, are around 61 trillion. To survive the slightest financial panic, the ratio of gold to bank money would need to be an order of magnitude higher. So this is his first rumination. And then he goes on to say, a far more important problem is that of financial stability. Economists of the Austrian school wish to abolish fractional reserve banking, but we know that this is a natural consequence of market forces. It's wasteful to hold 100% reserve if depositors do not need their money all of the time. Banks have a strong incentive to lend some of the money deposited, so expanding the aggregate supply of money and credit. So that is the basic thought process of what I have deemed a standard linear economist. But these guys are respected and people read them and they're given voice. That's all rubbish. Okay, that is complete rubbish. You know what was said by Martin Wolf, and I shall demonstrate why. But we have to go back to first principles. Now, in the beginning of time, silver was money. So let's assume that silver is money. Now, that procedure by which silver was determined to be money has been very well described by Carl Menger in The Origins of Money, which is available online, and I'm sure many of you have read it. So take that for granted. Now, the question arises, what do you do? What does a successful merchant or the successful individual, or any individual for that matter, do with their accumulated stockpile of silver beyond what they need, let's say, for daily expenses? What does anyone do? So, without sort of labouring on that point, the point is that everyone has a certain amount of silver in their possession, say. And the concept of keeping it safely necessarily arises from that condition. Now, you can keep your silver safely should you have small amounts of it. You know, you can keep it about your body, keep it in the safe, you know, bury it in the ground, whatever. Not really practical if you're a business or a huge merchant to do that kind of thing with your monetary holdings. So the concept of a safe storehouse was born. A safe storehouse. So just think of the necessary traits and character of the person to whom you would entrust the storage and safekeeping of your silver. Not any old pleb with a key in the warehouse would do, but a person of the utmost ethics and standing. Now, temples had a role. I'm not talking about Greek temples, I'm talking about Eastern temples per se. They had a role in keeping hold of people's gold and silver on a safekeeping basis. Just because it was assumed that there was no intent on behalf of the priests and the pundits with doing something with it. So the point is that the person had to be of the most noble character. You couldn't just have anyone doing that. Okay. So, we come to the concept of demand. Not demand in the economic sense of supply and demand, but demand in the sense of demand versus time. Now, keeping silver on demand means keeping the coin at home, or keeping it with a receipt at this said storehouse. Now, this receipt would enable you to go and get your silver at any time, no problem. There might be a little charge for storing it, obviously, and this is what the Bank of Amsterdam was founded for many centuries ago, and it collapsed for other reasons. But the Bank of Amsterdam was a pure demand deposit bank that facilitated payments, and they used to charge you for keeping your silver there because they didn't do anything with it, you know, or gold. So the amount of silver that you would need on demand is a subjective decision, and it might need you to cover day-to-day living expenses, clothing, food, transportation, whatever. But the point is, it's an entirely subjective decision. So when you hear someone like Martin Wolf say, it's wasteful to hold 100% reserve if depositors do not need their money all the time, you can see that he's usurping that subjective choice between what is needed on demand and what isn't needed on demand. But I don't think he would have the intelligence to realise that thing. Now, it's the remainder of the silver holdings that isn't required on demand that is used to create the principle of the silver bond and the associated counterpoint of the silver bond, which is the time deposit. Now, we should. I can't use that thing, so I'll have to draw this thing up here. might take us some time. So let's say your silver holdings are represented as such. So this is demand. This is what you require on demand. And this isn't. That's not required on demand. That means not. That's all. So let's talk about the mechanism of what happens when a loan is created. So the initiation of a loan for productive enterprise could be fashioned from one individual, say, and obviously it would be fashioned from silver that isn't required. By definition, it would be required from silver it would be financed from silver that's not required on demand. So, the dispersal of loan proceeds by the borrower for a productive enterprise, hopefully, not for consumption, Gucci handbags and watches or whatever, creates a subset of individuals whose aggregate increase in physical silver coin is a sum no greater than the amount initially lent. So, I hope that's clear. Basically, if you spend loan proceeds, then there'll be a subset of individuals whose aggregate monetary balance will increase as a consequence of spending those loan proceeds. So what happens is you create another subset of individuals and each one of these individuals is now certainly at the margin in the same position as the person who fashioned the loan in the first place. So they would have received an incremental amount of silver, and they can determine again subjectively what is required on demand and what isn't required on demand. But the process doesn't stop there. It continues, obviously. And that's what it looks like, you know, in ultimatum. It looks like a kind of fractal picture when you disperse loan proceeds. So what happens? In modern economics, it's assumed that this is a multiplying process. Okay, now, I hope I made clear that at each juncture, it's a subjective decision how much is required on demand and how much isn't required on demand. But what happens in modern banking, according to Basel rules, is that instead of this subjective determination of demand, the bank need only keep, according to Basel diktats, say only 10%. So the consequence of that is that you are somehow usurping the natural mechanism. If I, as an individual, only wanted to keep, let's say, 20% on demand, but the Swiss diktat says that you only need to keep 10% on demand, well, then the bank says, okay, fine. You know, you might want to keep 20%, but I only need to keep 10%, so I'm going to lend the other 10% out. The point is that that is a distortion of subjective determination. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but the process that I've described here is the mechanism behind the determination of the interest rate bid or the time preference element of the interest rate spread. Now, we all know there are two prices to any underlying good, the bid and the offer. The bond market is no different. This process here describes the time preference element. The other element is the productivity, the aspect of productivity, but I'm not going to go into that here. So the point about it is that you do all this, it doesn't happen, one by one. It's a continuous process, And what happens is that you create a system of assets, liabilities, this is the unusurped mechanism I'm describing here. So what happens is that from the process of this subjective determination of demand versus what is not needed on demand, you create a system of assets and liabilities. So the liabilities are defined by time deposits of varying maturities, and the corresponding asset is the silver bond. Now, this was all subjectively determined. The interaction was not predicated by rules as to what the bank needed to keep. So this system was perfectly stable. The person who had their silver on demand deposit could have access to their silver because it was fully matched by cash silver sitting in the vaults of the bank. The person with a 1 month time deposit will have to wait 1 month before his 1 month bond liquidates into silver, and so on. But the point is the rotation of all of this, and you have to imagine it rotating, it's perfectly stable because it was subjectively determined at each stage. There was no interference from Switzerland or anywhere like that. So the determination of the proportion of any individual silver that is required on demand is purely subjective, and it's certainly not the prerogative of the storehouse owner. So again, Mr. Wolf is misunderstanding the nature of what banking should be. The subjective determination of silver required on demand, coupled with the recursive procedure, gives rise to this. Okay? So is that all clear? Is this clear? Good. Now,
You're a little bit quick there. You said the word, was it recursive?
Recursive.
My limited understanding, does that mean that they had recourse to their...
Oh, no. Recursive is just a description of the process.
Okay.
If I determine what is required on demand versus not on demand, then I allow someone else to do that as well. So it's a recursive procedure in the sense that,
I'm a computer scientist by training. A recursive procedure is one that says you're going to divide the deposit into demand and time, and then call the procedure again and subdivide into another demand and time, and then take that time and divide that into demand and time, and keeps going until you finally get down to an infinitesimal amount. So it's a self-similar repeating process that repeats on itself. Does that make sense?
To a small degree. What you're effectively doing in that system is
Yeah.
you're not borrowing short and lending long. As
I haven't got
regards
to that yet,
software.
so-
You're matching your time
Yes.
deposits and your time liabilities. So
Exactly.
They're matched.
Exactly.
And that's
So-
a recursive process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Basically, the result is that you end up with a you end up with a system of now this is higher order money. They call it higher order money. You know, if you go up all the way up there, it will be M4 or something like that. You know, strictly it's not money, but it liquidates into money hopefully. You know, at some point. But the point is that what happened is economists saw that. They saw that you could multiply, inverted commas, the amount of cash silver to create all of these liabilities. And they said, well, instead of letting people determine at each stage how much they want to be lent out versus how much they want, they'll say, well, just make it 10%. Okay, so if I come and deposit a demand deposit of cash silver into a bank, they will say, well, you only need to keep 10% of that. You can invest the rest in safe assets like government bonds and the like. You know, but is that clear? But the point is that it looks the same superficially. So they said, well, just keep 10%. Whereas at each stage, it's a subjective process. It could be 6% with one person, 5%, it could be 100% with another person.
So that decision, if I may ask the question, that decision to nominate 10% as the start of fractional reserve version of the process of banking.
Yeah. Now I don't like because it's quite obvious that this system is fractional. You know.
But it's matched by.
But it's matched. Okay, and it's you know. Fraudulent fractionality would be this 10% thing. You know.
Sandeep, could we assume that you, in a certain sense, sum up all the individual demands, 5%, 10, 20, 30, blah, 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 and it works out to 13.5%.
Yeah, and that's
there
the
it is.
number.
And that's the number, and then tomorrow it's not the same number again,
Yeah.
because stuff has changed.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. But the point is, Basel thinks it's perfectly okay to say, well, it can be 13% forever. You know.
No, I mean, first of all, like I say, I'm not opposed to unnecessary government intervention, but doesn't having a set number give the government a degree of control over the money supply?
Yes.
So are you advocating
Yeah, it
letting the
does.
money supply go?
Sorry?
So under this system, you'd be letting the banking system control the money supply?
No, it's the person that controls the money supply, because it's the person at each stage that determines how much they want equivalently in their pocket on demand versus how much they don't want on.
So the money supply would be equal to our demand for money?
No.
A function of savings.
It's a function of savings. Yeah, it's a function of subjective preference. That's all. Money is the consequence. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll get to that in a bit because there's a bit more to go still. Okay, so I want to emphasise again that I haven't talked about it yet, but the concept of time deposit and bond is not dependent upon the existence of a literal storehouse. You don't actually need, a storehouse there. It's purely a concept of the mind. Ex mensis. But obviously, if you wanted to sell a bond ahead of expiry, it's quite hard to sell a bond that just exists in your head. And a notarized bond is much easier to find a bid for than something that you just remember. So what happened was that we're forgetting about the temples now. The temples have been left to what they're meant to be doing. More and more storehouses, as it were, come in. And that has the effect of reducing the bid-offer spread, between those that wish to borrow silver and those that wish to lend it. Now you should all be able to see how Dr. Wolf is obviously wrong in his assessment that the deposit base of 61 trillion doesn't match up with the cash value of gold of 1.3 trillion. Well, it was never bloody well meant to do that. Okay, I mean, look at the way the system originally formed. You don't compare the amount of cash silver to the amount of total liabilities and say, right, that means that silver has to be marked up 10 times or something because you're being fraudulent in some way. The $61 trillion of deposits don't exist at the same duration. They exist at vastly different durations. It's not current. And for someone like Martin Wolf to make that mistake is quite shocking. Very, very shocking that he did. Okay, so we've destroyed Martin Wolf, and it was quite easy to see how to destroy him.
Who's next?
Who's next?
I've got a list. Okay. Now, so you can everyone see how this should be a perfectly stable mechanism? Okay. If you wanted to lend money out for 1 month, and you have, then good for you. Okay. But if you need the cash before 1 month, well, then there's a clause in the contract which will say, there's a penalty. The poor banker has to go to the market, find a bid, for the bond, and might be lower than the par value, and there'll be a little haircut. You walk into any British bank these days, and they are throwing at you time deposits, and I've never seen that in my since I've lived there. Time deposits. Leave your money with us for 3 months. You can't access it early. If you want it early, there's a penalty clause of X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. But this is the way banking should be done, and they're just realising it after a long wait.
Can I ask just one question in terms of understanding this? And that you point about the stability. When was it demand exceeds supply?
Demand of what?
Demand for a loan.
If demand for money,
Yeah.
if demand for money exceeds supply, then interest rates would go up. I don't tend to think in supply and demand terms for money. Basically, the process here has the rinse and repeat. This process has the effect of lowering the interest rate bid. And the process of, and this is the time element of it, and the other element is the productivity. So people lending money obviously has the effect of drawing down the interest rate. People wanting to borrow money obviously has the effect of putting the offer up. And it's the storehouse, as it were, that comes in and tries to make a market and narrow that. I'm not sure how, supply and demand is a consequence of this, I mean, I can't quite see what you mean by
Well, I can see where you get the equilibrium and the balance where you go in your other picture.
Yeah.
Everything looks tickety-boo. I'm just trying to think, well, what could throw a spanner in the works?
Well, what could throw a spanner in the works is if all of these people suddenly needed the cash for some reason. That could cause a problem. But the point is, though, that you wouldn't lend your money for 24 months if you thought you might need it tomorrow. I mean, if you did, you're pretty stupid. But the point is, there has to be an element of human judgment in all of this as well. People think, 12-month time deposit, fine. There's no risk to that. What they're forgetting is that the counterpoint to that is a 12-month bond. And just because it has Royal Bank of Scotland on it doesn't mean that can't default. So that could be a problem. Okay, so we've got the mechanism there. Okay, and it's not difficult to see how you usurp that. Okay, so the most obvious fraud would be for the storehouse owner to lend demand deposits for any length of time. Okay. Now, should a person require access to their demand deposit and there's insufficient cash silver because of this, because they're doing this, then the storehouse owner, as it were, would have to go to the secondary market, find a bid, or the silver would have to be taken from their equity capital, if they have any. You know. This is if you lend out demand deposits. Now, although this isn't fraudulent, the lending of silver for non-productive enterprise is a problem, because there's no guarantee that the principal debt can be amortized at the end of the contract. So the point is that if you did that, for example, lending for unproductive enterprise, you could destroy the relevant time deposits. You know, that's the counterpoint to that at some point. You know.
I mean, if there was a mismatch of duration of the two.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not just that. I mean, if the bond defaulted, the associated time deposit should actually be written down as well. You know.
By unproductive, you mean literally something isn't created and therefore that money has disappeared effectively?
Oh no. You can borrow for unproductive enterprise. You know, if you can repay it somehow. You know, there's nothing.
Could we use consumer credit as an example?
Yeah, consumer credit as an example. You know, if you can repay your credit card bills, then fine. You know, but you know, most people just tend to roll over that kind of debt. You know. Okay, so what would happen is that, let's say a storehouse did take the principle of lending demand deposits a bit too far, or let's just say the whole financial system generally took this principle too far, and really took it to its extreme. You would obviously distort the assets beyond the subjective determination, beyond the subjective determination that should be done obviously individually. You will distort the liabilities, and you will have you'll have an inherently unstable system. This is kind of like the concept that Nutt-Wixell developed of the natural unobservable rate versus the market rate. And the distortion between and the difference between the two. So when you lend out demand deposits, you create a rate of interest that is likely to be below what it should be. You know, and it's fun for people who are doing it. Okay, but the point is this though. Okay. You've got a demand deposit, and you have no reason to suspect that, let's say 100 ounces. You've got no reason to suspect that 90 ounces of that is actually in the form of a government bond. But it is. So, now, if the whole system requires money on demand, not, let's say, a large amount, but just a marginal amount more than what was kept, what would happen is that assets would have to be liquidated very quickly. Very, very quickly. And that is what causes falling prices. It's not a reduction in demand. It's this process of liquidation, the contraction this is deflation. Okay. Deflation doesn't arise because of a lack of consumption. A lack of consumption is the consequence because all of your savings have been wiped out, as it were. So is that clear? Is that part clear? Because this is another misconception that it is a lack of consumer demand that causes prices to fall. You know, when it's not. It's not. It's because you're messing around and being funny here.
So just to clarify, it's an increase in demand for liquidated assets that causes depreciation.
Deflation.
Deflation, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Or falling prices. Don't use the word deflation. So, is that clear? Is that clear? I hope it's clear.
Basically what you're saying is that deflation is a monetary phenomenon. Just like we seem to have all forgotten that inflation is also a monetary phenomenon as opposed to a price phenomenon.
Yeah.
The price phenomenon is the consequence.
Haven't you just described a business cycle?
Yeah. I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. But it's the business cycle is. Can you see how it's not necessarily meant to happen? You know, it's not meant to happen because they're being funny, the Swiss. I only say that because Basel is in Switzerland, and that's where these rules were made up. So we've talked about how the financial system evolved from this, and the storehouse owner, having graduated to a licensed commercial bank now, many centuries later, was allowed by the authorities to only keep a fraction of the physical silver on demand. And we've talked about the fact that this number that has been given by Basel is just purely random. You know, I mean, as Rudy was saying, it happens to add up to 13.6, so let's make it 13.6 forever. You know, and it's quite surprising that they have such lack of sort of scientific rigor in applying this appropriately. But anyway, so what did they do with the 90%, say, that wasn't required on demand? Well, it would be in secure liquid investments, like, guess what?
Mortgages?
Yes, and mortgages, and etc., which have a deep secondary market. Now, what happens if there's a dearth of bids in the secondary market? Where do you get cash from? Well, don't worry. The newly created central bank is there, and they will be able to repo, technical term there. Repo means swap assets for cash. You know, they'll be able to do that and swap any assets against a cash advance. So the point about it is that you know, the ratio of physical silver, cash silver to total deposits is distorted, you know, beyond a natural determination of preference. And duration mismatch is born. Okay. Now, borrowing short to lend long is a subset of that. And I hope everyone can see that.
If we start with this and then all the banking systems that evolved from this, at what point do we develop M2, M3, etc.?
No, M2, M3 and all of that was already there.
Is it?
Yeah, it's already there. It wasn't invented later on. This is how it would have been in the 15th century, you know.
Because based on this, I'm only seeing how I'm not seeing past M1.
Well, I can't even remember. M1 is defined as
Cash and cash.
cash and checking accounts. Yeah.
And
Demand
time
deposit.
deposits.
And
Or-
less than 3 months. Or so.
But only for a certain,
Yeah.
like a year.
Yeah,
I think it
yeah.
goes to a year.
Yeah.
And M2 goes to longer time deposits.
So M2 is all of these. And
Yeah,
so
okay.
on. Yeah.
Then M3 includes the repos and all that stuff. Which they don't publish.
They don't. So, well, you can find shadow.
Shadow stats.
Yeah, not shadow works. Shadow cells. Okay. So you have the concept of duration mismatch, and that was born. The concept of duration mismatch was born. So what was the next procedure? Well, you know, these government loans, these loans eventually never tended to be amortized at expiry, but merely rolled on. Now, government